People who knew someone who died in a freak accident. What happened? A mom went ice skating. Little slip, fell, all everyone saw was her bump her head lightly. Family finished skating. On the ride home, she started speaking gibberish. Dad dropped kids at the grandparents', took mom to the brain swelling, coma, dead a week later. This happened to Liam Neeson's wife, only they were skiing. Fell and bumped her head, got checked out and assumed she was fine, and died later that day. Edit, thanks for the commenters who clarified. Apparently she died 2 days later after initially refusing treatment. I remember the details wrong, still very sad and unthinkable, though. Was just thinking of that. Natasha Richardson, who was a terrific actress. Wow, I never knew she passed. I watched The Parent Trap on repeat as a kid. Buddy of mine was working on his hot rod. Drunk, as usual, had the car on ramps, must have been crooked, and didn't block the rear tires. Car moved, shifted, off the ramps and crushed him. His fiancée found him after work the next day. Was a really fun dude. Great guy, but the whole story just kind of fit. There was a person at the beach who got impaled by a flying beach umbrella. Horrible situation. Her husband was right beside her and she died within seconds. When my mom was in her early 20s, her, my uncle, and grandmother were walking into a McDonald's. One of the patio table umbrellas caught wind and flew directly into her head from 40 feet away. Luckily, it was the broad side of the pole. Brain damage and a settlement from the company. Now she blames that umbrella for memory issues or other problems. Holy shit. After reading lots of these, this has to be the worst and not a death by misadventure. Alive 1 second, totally dead the next. Completely random, chance occurrence. To be fair, if I was going to die in a freak accident, I'd rather it be fairly instant than bleed out in agony. I'd prefer not to have a gory death for the sake of others, but if I do, I just want it to be as close to instant as possible. I don't fear dying, it's the idea of prolonged suffering that I'm terrified of. A friend of a friend showed up at his girlfriend's apartment with a head wound. He didn't know how it happened. He also didn't know how he drove over there. She took him to the ER where he ended up passing away. He had his keys, wallet and phone on him. The only thing we could think of is he might have tripped, fell and hit his head in the wrong spot. There's a couple stories of people with head injuries going on to do regular everyday tasks. One I remember was a guy who was shot by his son in the face. He did his entire morning routine and then when he went to get his paper he fell over on his front porch. And then there is another guy who was shot in the face and interviewed by police for a really long time because they thought he killed his girlfriend, all while having this gunshot wound in his head. I think he ended up passing away years later as a result. It was probably muscle memory that got him there. How awful. Or adrenaline. There was a woman who got attacked by a bear on her isolated mountain ranch. After fighting off the bear, with the help of her dogs, she got in her car and drove several miles down precarious mountain roads to the nearest fire station with her face ripped clean off and, one eyeball dangling out of its socket. She said she was almost totally blind and going into shock, but a combination of muscle memory and adrenaline somehow got her down the mountain safely. She did an AMA on Reddit once. Cool lady. She wrote a memoir, too. Edit to add, her name was Elena Hansen. Here's a link to her AMA https://www.reddit.com/r/yama/comments/1bin1l/I__was_mauled_by_and_score her Reddit account https://www.reddit.com/user/Elena Hansen. She's still an active user. Hi/u/Elena Hansen. And, her memoir https://www.amazon.com/chomp survived attack other cautionary/DP/19400142004. I read her memoir and I quite liked it. She's a funny woman who has lived a very interesting life, even aside from the bear attack. Elena here. Thanks very much for the kind words, eldest, me too, BTW. Coming up on 15 years after the incident, it's still one of the wackier misadventures of a life spent skirting the far reaches of the Laffer curve. If this comment section teaches us anything, it's to watch our 6 kids and always remember, everybody gets it in the end. YMMV. When I was a 13-year-old boy, I witnessed my grandfather die. He was less than 15 feet away from me when he was decapitated by shrapnel from a broken piece of heavy farm equipment. I'm 50 years old and still struggle with that moment in time. PTSD can be a real bitch. Something similar happened a few years back to a couple of students in the school I work at. They were sitting in their grandpa's truck while grandpa was trying to move some farm equipment. Not quite decapitation, but he got hit hard enough to kill him instantly. The kids were too young to go for help, like 4 and 5 or something like that, and they had to sit in that truck until their dad came looking for them. All of these stories, and this one is hitting me the hardest. Those poor kids just having to sit there scared and confused. That's terrible. I'm so sorry. A friend slipped and fell in the tub, cracked his head. His roommate found him a half hour later, died on the way to the hospital. My mom did this while picking me up in the bathroom. She didn't die, but she drove all the way to my daycare and told the woman who ran it, "I don't remember how I got here." She ended up getting treatment for a concussion. I've always been afraid of falling and dying in a bathroom. I tore my shoulder labrum falling in the shower. It seems like such an elderly person sort of way to get hurt, but I'm not old. Non-slip tub mats are like $5, people. It's a good investment. Yep. Little brother slipped in the shower when he was a teenager, banged his knee on the built-in ceramic soap dish in the wall. It broke. Sharp-edged remainder of the ceramic sliced his knee down to the bone in a fishhook shape. We ended up replacing the carpet on the stairs because every time he took a step down on his/mom's way to the hospital, blood came gushing out of his shoe. His scar is gnarly. I was snowboarding in 1997 in Switzerland with a good friend. He was skiing. I had caught an edge and landed on the back of my head while also twisting my knee badly. I was being looked over by the mountain rescue and first aid. I told my friend he could keep skiing. I would head back to our villa. I ended up going to sleep at around 6 p.m. as I had a hot shower and some Tylenol 3s after dinner. I woke up to see my friend hadn't returned and thought it was odd, but maybe he hooked up with a lady at some bar. Friend never came back from skiing. He was found deep in a crevasse the next afternoon and frozen to death. Shit, I once got stuck in a crevasse in Austria, Lech. I could hear people ski right above me and nobody would see me or hear me. It was early in the day, so I talked myself down from panic and reminded me that I had a good 8 hours of light, so I had to get to work. I slowly carved and crawled my way out of it. It was a frightening experience. Friend in middle school died skiing. She tried to jump off the chair lift before it got to the end. Her scarf got snagged and they said it basically snapped her neck and she hung herself. Wow, this is terrifying. Swimming, and one of my buddies was screwing with the grate thing over a drain at the bottom. Got his foot stuck and couldn't extricate himself. His brother, cousin, and I nearly drowned trying to free him, so we got to watch him die. Haven't thought about this one in a bit. I saw a Dateline episode about this kind of thing in the late 90s and it's been a fear of mine ever since. This was in '85. His brother just passed away last year from heart failure. They've changed the laws on covers as this has happened to others. Not often though. They now require 2 separate drains, at least 3 feet apart, to prevent one drain from having that much suction. I'm so sorry. That sounds incredibly traumatic. My neighbor was cleaning his gutters and fell off his roof because he missed his footing when stepping. Fell right on his head. This was a few years back now, but the family moved quickly after, even though it had been their house for like 30 years. I can't say I blame them. My husband's cousin was a New York City firefighter and survived 9/11. A few years later, he was helping a friend fix his roof, slipped, and fell to his death. I always felt it was especially awful that he'd been such a hero and had survived something so awful only to die in an accident shortly thereafter. My father-in-law almost walked off the roof last summer when we were doing shingles. 2-story drop onto a truck tailgate. But he was a climber, so he hooked his heel while teetering off the edge and pivoted onto the roof. It was a miracle. Can you describe the heel hook he performed a bit more? I'm having trouble picturing what he did with his foot/body to save himself. Sounds like a badass save regardless. The peak was to his right. He was walking backwards to set tar paper. He got his left foot halfway off the edge and went to take another step back, causing him to teeter and wave his arms. At this point most of his weight was behind him and he was starting to fall back. So he took his right foot and reached up the slope, hooked his heel, and pivoted on his left. He sort of just turned his fall direction enough that he was able to fall up the slope rather than off the house. It was sort of funny because he was telling us just moments earlier that roofers rarely fall off a roof. Usually they aren't paying attention and just walk right off. Basically what he almost did. Right before he took his last step we were all yelling at him, "Chris, look out." He said that if we wouldn't have yelled, he would have been a goner. A guy I went to high school with was helping his family do some repairs to a silo on their family farm. A section of the silo's roofing gave way and in he went, suffocated under thousands of pounds of grain. I have a deep fear of this. Not that I think I would ever find myself in that situation, but that seems like an awful way to die. My granddad lived on a farm and had a massive barn full of grain. As kids, 4 kids aged 4-9-ish, we found our way in and went swimming in it. We didn't know why our parents looked so horrified when they found us. Every year here in the plains we also have 1 or 2 people who die by walking on top of grain or corn in a silo. The people who survived being quicksanded by grain often say they did that because it would have been too much effort to attempt repair work with long planks to prevent sinkage, and it's easier to just walk across the top. Never ever 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 try to walk across grain or corn. I attended a farm safety demo as a kid, where a future farmer of America walked into a corn hopper. He worked his way into being buried up to his waist, then we audience members were invited to pull him out. We couldn't, of course. My uncle was mowing grass on an embankment next to a small body of water. The mower unexpectedly slipped down the embankment and overturned on top of him, pinning him under the water. He drowned in a few feet of water that he otherwise could have stood up in. Edit. Lots of folks asking where/when. Not recent, about 13 years ago in the American Southeast. Based on responses, though, maybe not as much of a freak accident as I thought. Seems to happen a lot. I mow a lot for work and rollovers scare the shit out of me. When my mom was working in hospitals, they had a patient whose tractor rolled over him and he fell into a ditch with water. He was so lucky because he was on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, and when he rolled over, a car passed by. The woman driving rushed to his aid and held his head out of the water. This was before cell phones, so she had to wait holding him until another car drove by and then rushed to the nearest house to use the phone. Guy made a full recovery thanks to that woman being there at the exact right time. So much of life is just complete luck, it's wild. I read something once that said, if you knew how many times you narrowly missed death and the number of times you screwed up a sure thing, you'd go insane. A friend of mine was riding his four-wheeler out at an off-road park. He kicked up a tree branch that impaled him in the thigh. He bled to death before anyone even knew it happened. I knew a brother and sister who were riding four-wheelers through the woods on the back of their property, and the sister was in the front. They were racing, and looked back to make a face at her brother and didn't see a branch about neck high. She did not make it and it fucked him up. I got nailed by a branch to the face snowmobiling back in the day. Took a few layers off my helmet, glad it was a full face one. Buddy's uncle got decapitated by a wire fence a few years before that. That's crazy, man. Just this week some guy was caught putting wire across bike trails in my area. You should get charged for attempted murder for that shit. Teacher in my school lost all 3 kids in a freak traffic accident on the highway. Their car lost a tire, which caused them to swerve into the gas tank of a semi-truck, which exploded, killing 2 of them instantly. The 3rd kid managed to crawl out of the car while he was on fire, and died later in the hospital. The saddest part is that they were all on their way to visit their father in the hospital after his back surgery. This may be the most heart-wrenching one. One night at a trauma center I worked in, we had 3 patients initially come in, a dad and 2 daughters. One was 6 and one was 3. The dad accidentally rolled his SUV over a highway off-ramp and landed roof down. All of them dead. We called time of death on the dad pretty quickly but worked both kids for quite a while. Both ended up dying. Turns out another daughter walked away with a broken arm and was found walking down the highway away from the crash. Awful night. Lovely girl I went to HS with got a scholarship to a prestigious university, being one of the very few students from my shitty school to make it to college or uni. 2 weeks into term her roommate found her laying in her bed dead. The heating boiler was faulty and she'd died of carbon monoxide poisoning in her sleep. We'd even thrown a party for her to celebrate her achievement. This was in 1996 and I'm tearing up a bit thinking about this. R.I.P. Sonia. My aunt died like this. She and 4 other people, and a dog, died due to a faulty chimney/vent from a boiler flooding several apartments with CO. She was a gold medal Special Olympian. She loved The Wizard of Oz. She was very kind to me. I miss her every day. The loophole law that allowed her apartment building to not have CO detectors has since been fixed. Now my family buys them for people in need so that this doesn't happen to anyone else. My son and his GF almost died in their rental, carbon monoxide from the furnace. Their cat woke her up and she could barely get him out. Fire department guys were amazed they made it out. He said that it was the worst headache afterwards he'd ever had. Good, wonderful, heroic kitty. My whole family and cousin's family almost died in an old cabin due to a faulty liquid propane refrigerator. The only reason we survived was that my mom woke up thirsty and thought she heard someone chopping wood right outside the window. Turns out it was her heartbeat in her head she was hearing. I remember waking up outside on a bench and seeing my parents loaded into an ambulance. Carbon monoxide poisoning is no joke. A mother and 3 little kids died by CO2 and NZ. The mother accidentally left the car running in the garage with the door attached to the house left ajar. Greater than the location of Ms. George's body is consistent with a last-minute realization that the car was still running and an attempt to reach the garage to turn it off. She may have lost consciousness and collapsed. Really tragic. If you live in corn-heavy Midwest areas of America, you're probably familiar with detasseling. Detasseling is a job a lot of smaller towns will let kids do, I think from 13 up? With parental permission. It's very common where I'm from. Essentially, you just walk with a group of other people through cornfields pulling the tassel off the top to prevent them from germinating and seeding excessively. Anyway, like 2 years after I did it, there was an accident involving 2 high school freshmen stepping into a puddle that an electric irrigator was shorting into. One of them basically died immediately, the other en route. R.I.P. Hannah and Jade. There are so many weird ways to die on a farm/ranch. Nebraskan here. I worked closely with farmers/ranchers in rural NE for quite a few years. Literally every family has a story of a family member dying in some weird, potentially horrific way. Or a neighbor almost dying and overcoming death in a Herculean manner. I.e. my mom and dad had a friend growing up in his early 20s fall off the tractor which subsequently took most of his leg off. So he army crawled roughly a mile back to his truck, got into the truck, was able to drive back to his farm and called the operator to get paramedic services. They went to his address, but on the east instead of the west, so they were 10 minutes delayed. He still survived and continued to farm well into his 80s. I grew up 20 minutes north of Freeport and remember this story. It happened the first year I was old enough to detassel, but our parents wouldn't let us do it after that incident. We didn't have internet back then and were told they drowned. A guy I knew was setting up a rope swing over a lake for his kids and their friends, which he had done many times before. He always would take a practice swing himself before he would let the kids go. His hand slipped off the rope and he fell before he was over the lake. He hit his head on a rock and died in front of the kids. In high school I came home from a night out telling my dad how we were out at a quarry with a rope swing. My dad knew exactly where I was talking about and absolutely lost his shit on me. My dad never yelled at me, but a friend of his lost his teenage son. He drowned in that quarry. Childhood friend of mine drowned. His leg got trapped swimming in a relatively shallow river. He went down and just never came back up. It happened to one of the nicest people I ever knew and it makes me so mad that we lost touch before I found out what happened. I knew a girl that died the same way. Craziest part about it was that she was with her dad who was a professional rafting guide. He immediately jumped out after her and tried to pull her out but couldn't. They actually had to dam up the river the next day to retrieve her body. Don't fuck with rivers. Yup. Always bring your legs up to the surface and get your feet to face downstream. https://raft1.com/okoi rafting/ what do if fall out of raft/. I had a slowly deflating inner tube going down light rapids and I got a lot of practice on a long river. There was one time my foot got pinned between 2 rocks and my head was downstream. If I hadn't been somewhat decently physically fit it could have been very bad. If I remember what my instructor told me correctly. Don't try to stand up even in shallow water. Go limp and don't try to fight the current. Keep your limbs in as much as you can. According to her father and other witnesses, that's exactly what she did. She did everything right and still died. Girl I grew up with was driving home in college and go into a horrible car accident that gave her brain damage and pretty much removed her jaw from her skull. Tons of surgery and 3 years later, she walked down the aisle at her wedding. She was in her yard a few months after her wedding and slipped/tripped/felt dizzy and fell. They aren't sure. And hit her head on pavement patio and her husband found her dead. That's just tragic. That went from sad, to very positive, to super sad. A girl I went to grade school with was crushed under a Smith machine at a local gym. 24-hour gym so no one was around to help. People seemed to completely ignore the safety bars on Smith machines, oddly enough. The TV station I worked at previously had a gym in it, and during the midnight shift, the security guard, during his break, decided to lift some weights alone in the gym. He lifted the bar, which was apparently too heavy, and it came crashing down and cut off his circulation. No one discovered him until about 6 hours later when someone came in to use the shower in the gym. An old buddy I had known since elementary school died while driving when a chunk of loose gravel was kicked up through his windshield by a passing truck on the freeway. His best friend had been riding in the passenger side and had to steer the car to safety. It was nobody's fault. Just a complete freak accident. I've always felt terrible for the friend who had to watch it happen. I think about my friend who died a lot. He was a really cool guy. I still remember playing basketball with him during recess when we were kids. It's strange to think that he never could have known how his life would end or see it coming in any way. That kid I used to play basketball thought he still had an entire life ahead of him. You can die due to a fucking piece of gravel? Fuck. Life is unfair. I actually almost had this happen to me literally last night. Was driving on a back highway and a truck coming the other way, kicks up some gravel and I hear an insanely loud thunk. Thankfully it was fairly small and hit the most secure part of the windshield, but it was shocking to realize my mortality. If it had been a bit bigger and a couple inches over, I could have died then and there. A family friend bumped his head, walked about 15 feet across his backyard, sat at his picnic table and died. Autopsy showed no head trauma, but he broke his neck when he hit his head. They figured the walk across the yard caused something to shift enough to do fatal damage to his spinal cord.